In 1286, a physician at the University of Montpellier examined a young man who could not eat, could not sleep, and wept without provocation. The doctor did not ask who had broken his heart. He checked the patient's pulse, consulted an Arabic medical text translated into Latin a century earlier, and wrote his diagnosis in the margin of the case record. The disease was amor herios, heroic love, a pathology of the brain caused by excessive contemplation of a single woman's face. The prescribed treatment was exercise, moderate wine, good conversation, and sexual intercourse with several different women, administered as clinical medicine. Not moral advice, not a priest's counsel. A university-trained physician's prescription, written with the same seriousness he would have applied to a case of fever. That is where this story begins. Not with roses or vows, but with a diagnosis. Because in medieval Europe, falling in love was not the beginning of a great romance. It was the beginning of a medical crisis. And marriage, the institution you might assume was built to contain that love, had almost nothing to do with it. You already know that medieval marriages were arranged. You may have heard that brides were young, that families negotiated terms, that love was irrelevant. What you probably have not heard is how completely, how systematically, and for how many centuries the entire apparatus of European civilization, the church, the nobility, the law, and the medical profession cooperated to ensure that romantic love and marriage never occupied the same room. Not because they forgot about love, because they feared it. Picture a stone hall in northern France, late 12th century. A long oak table, candles, beeswax, because the families here can afford it, and they want you to know. On one side sit the representatives of the bride's father. On the other, the agents of the groom's family. The bride is not present. The groom may not be either. Between the two parties lie documents, parchment heavy with Latin and wax seals. An abacus or counting cloth sits at the table's center, because what is being calculated is not affection. It is value. The negotiation has already taken weeks. The bride's family will provide a dowry, land, silver, livestock, household goods. In Italian families, a carved wooden chest called a cassone might hold the linens and plate, its painted panels depicting mythological scenes that no one at the table is looking at. The groom's family will guarantee a dower, typically 1/3 of his landed property, to support the bride if she outlives him. Which manors will constitute the dower? Which rents? The specific fields are named. The income is estimated. Intermediaries shuttle between the principals. If the numbers do not work, the marriage does not happen. It is a merger, and both sides have lawyers. The bride might be 15. She might be 16. She might be meeting the groom for the first time at the church door, not inside the church, because in England and much of Northern Europe, the wedding ceremony was performed at the church porch, in facie ecclesiae, with the nuptial mass afterward inside. She is not wearing white. White wedding dresses are a 19th century invention. She is wearing her best wool or silk, and the face across from her is a stranger's. What she feels about this stranger is not a question anyone in the institutional architecture of her life has thought to ask. Among the aristocracy, this was the system. Georges Duby, the French historian who spent decades in the archives of medieval marriage, documented it with granular precision. From roughly the 9th through the 14th centuries, marriage among the European nobility functioned as a mechanism for transmitting property, forging political alliances, and producing legitimate heirs. Love was not irrelevant, the way flavor is irrelevant to a nutritional chart. Love was suspect. Love was dangerous. Because love made people irrational, and an irrational lord might marry a woman who brought no land, no alliance, no political advantage, only the catastrophic fact that he wanted her. But here is where the story turns stranger than the familiar arranged marriage narrative. Because the families were not the only power at the table. The church was there too, and the church had its own reasons for distrusting love, reasons that had nothing to do with property and everything to do with the soul. Augustine of Hippo, writing around the year 401, laid down a framework for marriage that would govern Christian theology for a millennium. He listed 3 goods of marriage: offspring, fidelity, sacramental permanence. Notice what is absent. Love is not on the list. Companionship is not on the list. Personal happiness is not on the list. Marriage, in Augustine's system, was good because it produced children within a legitimate framework, prevented adultery, and could not be dissolved. It was a structure, a container. Paul had said it plainly in the 1st century. It is better to marry than to burn. Marriage was not a celebration of union. It was a firebreak against lust. Jerome went further, arguing that marriage was only one step above fornication. And Thomas Aquinas, the greatest systematic theologian of the 13th century, wrote that sexual intercourse within marriage was venially sinful if it was motivated by pleasure rather than procreation. Even in the marital bed, desire was a contaminant. The holiest married people, by the Church's own standards, were the ones who never touched each other at all. Diane. Eliot's research into spiritual marriage documents case after case of medieval saints and holy women celebrated precisely because they refused consummation. Christina of Markyate, a 12th century Englishwoman, fought her family and 2 attempted marriages to preserve her virginity, ultimately becoming an anchoress. The Church held her up as exemplary. The message was clear. Marriage was a sacrament, one of the 7. But the most sacred version of this sacrament was the one that most resembled not being married. If you are sensing a contradiction, you are paying attention. Because the same Church that treated desire as a spiritual hazard did something extraordinary in 1215. At the 4th Lateran Council, it formalized a requirement that had been building in canon law since Gratian codified it around 1140. A valid marriage required the free consent of both parties. Both, including the bride. This was, on paper, revolutionary. It meant that a marriage forced upon an unwilling woman was, in the eyes of God and canon law, no marriage at all. Church courts heard cases where women challenged forced unions. Some won. Richard Helmholtz, working through the records of English ecclesiastical courts, found litigation that reads like a collision between 2 worlds. The world of the family, which had already negotiated the dowry and sealed the alliance, and the world of canon law, which said that none of it mattered if the bride had not freely agreed. But the gap between law and life was vast. Canon law gave medieval brides the right to say no. Medieval society made sure that almost none of them could afford to use it. Social pressure, economic dependence, family obligation, and the raw power dynamics of a feudal household combined to make canonical consent a theological nicety that real women navigated at their peril. The law existed. The freedom, in most cases, did not. I want you to hold that contradiction, because it defines the medieval experience of marriage more precisely than any single generalization can. The system was not simply oppressive. It was contradictory. Oppressive and progressive at the same time. In the same institution, enforced by the same officials. Now, you have likely heard that medieval people married at 12 or 14. This is one of those half-truths that buries the full story. Among the high aristocracy, where dynastic stakes drove early betrothals, children could be formally promised to each other at 7 or younger. A betrothal was not a marriage, but a binding contract, a future locked in before the children understood what was being traded. The canonical minimum age for marriage itself was 12 for girls, 14 for boys, understood as the approximate ages of physical maturity. But this was an elite practice, driven by the politics of succession. Among the English peasantry, and peasants were 90% of the population, the picture was entirely different. Barbara Hannawalt, working through manorial court records and coroner's rolls, found that peasant marriages happened in the late teens and early 20s. John Hajnal's landmark 1965 demographic study identified a distinctive Western European marriage pattern. Average marriage ages in the mid to late 20s for men, early to mid-20s for women, with high rates of people who never married at all. Child marriage was not the medieval norm. It was the medieval 1% strategy for locking in political alliances before the children could object. If you have been carrying the image of a continent of child brides, set it down. The image belongs to the castle, not the village, and even in the castle, it was recognized as extreme. So the families negotiated. The church theologized. The law contradicted itself. And into this system, this airtight, transactional, spiritually ambivalent apparatus, walked the troubadours. Southern France, the late 11th century. William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful lords in Europe, writes poetry. Not devotional verse, not battle songs. Love poems. Poems in which the speaker is helpless before a woman who is not his wife, in which desire is an ungovernable horse and the lover has dropped the reins. William is the first troubadour whose work survives, and he sets the pattern for a tradition that will reshape the Western imagination. The rules of Fenimore, refined love, what later centuries would call courtly love, were precise. The beloved was always a married woman, typically the wife of the lover's lord. The love was secret. The lover served, suffered, and idealized from a distance. Consummation was either unattainable or hidden, and the central, structural principle was this: true love could not exist between husband and wife. Around 1185, at the court of Marie de Champagne, Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, a cleric named Andreas Capellanus wrote a treatise called De Amore, on love. In it, he attributed a judgment to the Countess Marie. Love cannot exert its powers between two people who are married to each other because marriage involves obligation and compulsion, while love requires freedom. Whether Marie actually said this is debated. That the principle it articulates was embedded in the courtly love tradition is not. If you are ready to see this as romantic rebellion, young poets defying the cold machinery of arranged marriage with the heat of genuine passion, pause. Because the political reading is darker and more interesting. Georges Duby argued that courtly love served the feudal system rather than threatening it. Medieval Europe was full of jouvains, young men of noble birth who had not yet inherited land, could not afford to marry, and had no institutional outlet for their ambitions or their desires. They were a destabilizing force. Courtly love literature channeled that energy into ritualized devotion. The lady the knight served was his lord's wife. Devoting himself to her kept him loyal to the household. The poetry of adoration reinforced the hierarchy of service. As long as the love remained unconsummated, or at least discreet, it was not rebellion. It was management. Troubadour poetry looked like the one place in medieval culture where love could breathe. It may have been the feudal system's most sophisticated instrument of control. And meanwhile, in the medical schools, love was being treated as a clinical emergency. Mary Frances Wack's definitive study traces the diagnosis of amor herios through Arabic medical texts, Avicenna's Canon, Haile Abbas's Pantagruel, translated into Latin by monks like Constantine the African at Monte Cassino in the 11th century. The symptoms were precise: loss of appetite, insomnia, rapid pulse, paleness, fixation on one person to the exclusion of all else. If untreated, lovesickness progressed to melancholy, madness, and death. A physician diagnosing a lovesick patient took his pulse, a standard diagnostic method. If the pulse quickened at the mention of a specific woman's name, the diagnosis was confirmed. The brain had been overheated by excessive contemplation of a beautiful form. The blood was dangerously disrupted. This was not metaphor. This was clinical language, taught in universities, written into medical textbooks, applied with the same rigor as any other diagnosis. Love was a disease. Marriage was a contract. And the most sacred version of marriage, according to the institution that controlled access to the sacraments, was the one where nobody touched anyone at all. Tell me this system does not deserve your attention. In the early 15th century, a woman named Marjorie Kempe lived in the town of Lynn in Norfolk, England. She was married to a man named John. They had 14 children. And after years of marriage, Marjorie wanted out, not of the marriage itself, which was indissoluble, but of the conjugal obligation. She wanted to live in celibacy, devoting herself to God. What followed was not a theological argument. It was a business negotiation. Marjorie records the conversation in what is now recognized as the earliest autobiography in the English language. John agreed to her terms. His conditions were specific. She would pay his debts. She would eat with him on Fridays, a small social concession that maintained the appearance of a functioning marriage. In return, he would no longer require her body. She bought her freedom with bookkeeping. This is what marriage looked like from the inside, when a medieval woman found a crack in the system wide enough to negotiate through. Not romance, not theology, leverage. If you have been carrying a question through this story, when did love finally enter marriage? The answer is more recent than you think, and stranger. Stephanie Coontz, whose comprehensive history of marriage traces the arc from antiquity to the present, places the decisive shift between roughly 1750 and 1850. The forces were multiple. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in the 16th century, elevated marriage above celibacy. Luther called it the foundational social institution and rejected monasticism entirely. This did not immediately make marriage romantic, but it removed the theological framework that had positioned married life as spiritually inferior to virginity. Then came the Enlightenment, the pursuit of happiness as a right, the novel as a literary form, placing individual emotional experience at the center of narrative. Personal correspondence between spouses in the 17th and 18th centuries begins to show a growing expectation that husband and wife should actually like each other. By the early 19th century, love was becoming not just acceptable, but expected as the basis for choosing a partner. And here is the part that the medieval system's defenders, had they been alive to say it, would have predicted. When love became the foundation of marriage, marriage became fragile. The arranged marriage system had been cold, transactional, and often cruel. But it did not depend on feelings, and feelings are unstable. The love-based marriage is warmer, more humane, more attuned to the dignity of the individual heart. It is also breakable in a way the old system never was, because love can end. And when the reason for the marriage disappears, the marriage has no structural basis left. Divorce rates, negligible for centuries under the old regime, began their long historical climb precisely when people started marrying for love and discovering that love does not always last. The medieval theologians who called romantic love a form of madness were not entirely wrong about the diagnosis. The medieval physicians who classified it as a disease of the brain were describing something real: the obsessive fixation, the disrupted sleep, the inability to eat, the impaired judgment. The families who negotiated marriages like mergers were protecting their wealth and their alliances, but they were also protecting their children from the consequences of decisions made in a state of what modern psychology would recognize as limerence, the neurochemical storm of early infatuation that impairs rational function as reliably as any fever. They built a system to contain it. The system held for 1,000 years. And when it finally broke because people decided that the danger was worth it, that choosing your own partner, even at the risk of choosing wrong, was a form of freedom they would no longer surrender. If you have ever sat across from someone and known, with a certainty that no contract or calculation produced, that this was the person, you are living inside the revolution that the medieval world spent a millennium trying to prevent. The troubadours sang about it in code. The physicians diagnosed it as pathology. The theologians ranked it below celibacy. The families locked it out of the negotiating room. And still it won. Whether it was worth the cost, the instability, the divorces, the expectations that no single human being can consistently meet, is a question every generation since the 19th century has answered for itself. The medieval answer was clear. Love was too dangerous to be trusted with something as important as marriage. The modern answer is the opposite. Marriage is too important to be trusted to anything except love. Both answers have consequences. Both are still shaping the choices people make tonight, in apartments and houses, and quiet conversations where two people are deciding whether what they feel is enough to build a life on. The medieval negotiators would have told them to check the numbers first. The troubadours would have told them the feeling matters more than any contract. Somewhere between those two positions, you have already made your choice. If this is the kind of history that changes how you see the structures you live inside, there is more ahead. The institutions, the silences, the decisions that still govern the daily architecture of your life without your knowing it. Stay close. The record runs deep, and we have barely begun to read it.